I'm going to talk just a little bit about the history of advocacy and peaceful protest, particularly in Edmonton, since that's the location of the article that I asked you to read for this class. So I thought I'd give you just a tiny bit of history about peaceful protest as it relates to Alberta in particular. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I thought that it would be interesting for you to see how far back peaceful protest does go in the province. So in 1914, 500 unemployed men marched through Edmonton protesting government inaction on unemployment and economic inequality. The Edmonton Journal labeled the group a mob and wrote that they tramped about the streets. So you can see that this kind of protest has often been seen as uh, unsavory, um, undignified, even in times of peaceful protest. Peaceful protesters are often vilified. And you can see that this goes back a long way in the history of Alberta. Um, During the earlier part of the century, of the 19th century, the majority of protests were within the context of the labor movement. Later on, there were protests about the Vietnam War, less so in Canada than in the US, but they did exist. Um, Another memorable moment in the labor movement was in 1986, and I actually remember this. Some of you might have heard relatives or someone talk about this, in fact. Gainer's employees walked out of the Edmonton meatpacking plant, which was owned by millionaire Peter Pocklington. So, Peter Pocklington at that time was also the owner of the Oilers, and so he was a well known millionaire in Edmonton. And so it was pretty easy for Edmontonians to get behind the workers. Peter Pocklington employed scabs to take their place, and so um, the the strike did last for over 6 months. In one memorable demonstration at the legislature, over 6,000 people showed up. So there was a lot of support. Eventually, the Alberta government made a sweetheart deal with Pocklington, who agreed to freeze the workers' wages for 2 years and protect their pensions. The event is seen as a seminal moment in the labor movement. This is one of my favorites. You might want to actually Google Tooker Gomberg. He was quite a fascinating fellow and one of the earlier environmental activists in this province. Uh, many people within the activist community, especially the older people, remember Tooker Gomberg. I never met him. He died in 2004, but I've heard that he was just a really lovely human. So in 2002, Tooker Gomberg locked himself in a safe in Alberta Premier Ralph Klein's constituency office in protest against the province's stance on Kyoto. Another memorable moment, 2008, two Greenpeace activists lowered a banner behind Ed Stelmach during a fundraising dinner at the Shaw Conference Centre in Edmonton. The banner read, "Stelmach, the best premier oil money can buy." And so you can see how the kind of activism that we see really reflects world as well as local events. So when the labor movement was strong, they were fighting for workers' rights, and that went on for a really long time. So peaceful protest is usually not a quick solution to anything, and I want to emphasize that. If you're looking for a quick solution, peaceful protest is not likely to get that for you. It's a long game. Later, when people started to become concerned in the province about things like the oil sands and oil and gas development, um, the environmental movement started to rise. Although it's only been recently that we've seen the kind of marches that we saw in 2019 when Greta Thunberg came to Edmonton. But Greta Thunberg wasn't the only draw. There was another march about a month before she came that was quite well attended too. So it isn't just Greta Thunberg that has created this change. That it's really reflected, I think, broader concerns of the community. So I'm not going to talk that much about violent protest, but I think that it's important to note that there's evidence that peaceful protests are more successful than violent protests. And that's probably largely because they build a wider coalition. It's also easier for governing bodies to negotiate with peaceful um, protests. It's because it's easier for larger numbers to get behind peaceful protests. Uh, the messages of peaceful protesters tend to get more broadly shared as well. So these are all some of the reasons that might tie into that. So there are differing definitions of peaceful protests, but peaceful protests do not pose a safety hazard of any kind. They do not pose a danger of riot, disorder, or threat to public security. So why might people want to peaceful protest? If people have tried to speak out on an issue and they've been ignored repeatedly, often this is their last hope of getting their voices heard. So, marginalized voices often turn to peaceful protest as a way to get their voices heard. Peaceful protest elevates marginalized voices. It normalizes new ideas. It helps to create community. So often, as a result of peaceful protest, there's community building and people feel less alone. They feel like there are other people out there who share the same views. Peaceful protest allows people a way to express themselves for or against the decisions of government and powerful organizations. So sometimes simply voting doesn't illustrate the nuance of people's understandings and people's needs and views. Sometimes a vote for this person and no vote for that person isn't quite enough to get change. Sometimes powerful organizations, they have deep pockets, and so they can hire good PR teams and they can contribute to communities and build playgrounds and all of these things. And so it's easy for people to be ignored by government and organizations. And of course, that leads to the next point. Peaceful protest allows underrepresented groups to push for reform. And something that maybe we don't always think about is peaceful protest supports and offers a check to the democratic process. So, peaceful protest is actually one of the, the variables that can help to uphold a strong democratic system. Other things that do that are non governmental organizations, watchdogs, um, as well as journalists. Um, Even democracies can be threatened. And so it's important that we have these kinds of forums for open discussion about a myriad of issues. Just to give you a broader sense of peaceful protest and what that might look like, a couple of well known historical uses of peaceful protest: the Salt March. Maybe some of you haven't heard of the Salt March, but you've probably heard of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was an Indian political activist who opposed British colonial rule in India. So, India was ruled by Britain up until 1947. So relatively recently, really. And India was rich in resources, and Britain was loath to give it up as a colonial state. Um, and so Gandhi was at the forefront of protesting British rule. He believed in the effectiveness of civil disobedience, and he led a number of nonviolent protest movements. The most famous was the Salt March of 1930. Uh, the, the march was um, in protest of salt taxation, but really it was part of a much larger movement that attempted to bring international attention to British rule and to protest British rule. And so, it wasn't for 17 more years after the Salt March that India gained self rule. Again, peaceful protest is the long game. It's never fast. Suffrage in Canada, it wasn't just women who lacked the vote for many, many years. It was also Indigenous peoples and Asian persons. I would say that women had the largest movement, though, perhaps because they had more of a voice. Uh, as as the move towards women's rights grew, there were more professional women, there were more university graduates, there were more men supporting women in their fight to get the vote. And so the suffragists weren't just women, but the I would say that the majority of the activism that we hear around the suffrage movement is women's suffrage. In 1918, female citizens over the age of 21 were finally granted the federal vote, but it wasn't until much later that other groups were granted the vote. In fact, it wasn't until 1960 that treated Indigenous peoples were allowed to vote without risk of losing their treaty status. And of course, there are many other cases of peaceful protest. I just wanted to mention this article. I hope you read it. It talks about, in particular, the Climate Justice Organization in Edmonton and how it's been working on um, rallying people to the cause of a just transition as well as climate justice. Um, there's a little bit in here about Extinction Rebellion Edmonton, which is also a very active organization. I would say that there's one statement in this article that I kind of disagree with, and so I want to draw it to your attention. In 2015, the year of the Paris Climate Agreement was supposedly marked by an increase in mainstream discussion of climate justice. It doesn't have a lot to show for itself in terms of organizing capacity. By any measure, much of the work that's been done in Edmonton is a pure loss. I disagree with that. I think that peaceful protest is, as I said earlier, a long game. I'm immeasurably proud of the work of Edmonton activists on climate change and environmental issues. At the same time, I absolutely recognize how difficult this is and how many people burn out because they just feel like it's a lost cause. I know that people were really frustrated when Rachel Notley finally got into power, and one of the first things she did was support the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. That's not to say that there weren't many NDPers who supported Rachel Notley in her decisions, but there were many who didn't. And so there was a real fissure there over her decision to do that, even though I recognize that it was a pragmatic one. Yeah, I think frustration comes with the territory anytime that you're trying to uh, change an entrenched system, especially when it's a system that's supported by a lot of money and interests.